Welcome to Astounding Stories of Space and Time. I'm Mardell, and here is part 2 of The Undetected by George O. Smith. It was more than a coincidence. Florence Wood had been in that soaking rain and whipping wind for more than an hour. Any housewife would have corroborated my statement that only a prolonged soaking can achieve a truly wet-through-the-seams condition. Oh, Daddy Wood was just the guy to think of a stunt like saturating the seams and fibers of his daughter's clothing by agitating the water supersonically at high amplitude, but let's face it, that would have beaten the hell out of her soft white skin. As for the umbrella, the wound could indeed have been made by a rapier-like thrust. But a comparison between the depth of the wound and the length of the tip showed that the bottom of the wound could not have been reached without forcing part of the umbrella itself into the victim's body. The face of the wound showed no such outsized penetration, hence the umbrella was not the sought-for weapon. At this point, Chief Weston's telephone interrupted him, and he snatched it up, bellowed his name, and then listened. Finally, he snarled that it was for me and fairly hurled the handset at me. I caught it at the end of its cord and said, "Captain Schnell, special detail." "Oh, I know it is you, Captain Schnell," said the suave voice of Edward Hazlitt Wood. "I just wanted to tell you that your analysis of the umbrella's uselessness as evidence was quite brilliant. Also, your logic in the matter of my daughter's rain-soaked clothing was clever. I really don't regret the chewing out that you were getting. You deserve it. I was hoping to find you bright enough to avoid it. Anyway, can we expect you for dinner this evening?" "Yes," I snapped and hung up, thinking of a few things that would have called for a terse reprimand about foul and abusive language if telepathy were administered by the Federal Communications Commission. "What?" snapped Chief Weston. "Yes. Date?" he snarled. I groaned. Wood did have the nasty telepath's ability to maneuver me into a situation that I could not conveniently avoid. "When they start calling the office to pester you for dates." "I know what I'm doing." "So do I," he yelled. "You're doing nothing." "Listen, Chief, I'll admit the long arm of coincidence, but you'll have to admit that when there's trouble, I'm usually the first one to smell it." "So, how do you connect them up?" "Chief, I walk out of that apartment with your own words ringing in my ears. Looks like the classical setup for a perfect crime, you said, and then I meet this girl who just happens to have a father who writes whodunits and is planning a series of books based upon the perfect crime." "Oh, maybe," sneered Chief Weston. "The guy's a mind reader." "I've even given that some consideration." "So I hear tell." "Any objections?" I asked. "Objections? I've got a lot of objections," he howled. "This is the police department, not the soothsayers' convention. We're subject to enough criticism as it is. You needn't have added the act that makes us look like a bunch of damn fools." "But Chief, So what do I hear tell?" He hauled the tray drawer of his desk open and pulled out one of the tabloids, open to one of its hate everything columnists. "Listen. In recent years, the legality of the famous witchcraft trials of the past have been subject to debate, with the result that these past convictions have now been declared miscarriages of justice. Posthumously, I must unhappily add. However, there has been little or no amendment to the laws against witchcraft, wizardry, charms, amulets, and spells. But brace yourselves, citizens. One of our younger and more brilliant captains of detectives has shown an interest recently in parapsychics and may be training to track down criminals by the application of extrasensory detection. If this be true, the laws will have to be ruptured to permit him to secure evidence, since it is a tenet of the law that evidence must be secured through legal methods and processes. Fortune tellers of the world, arise! You have nothing to lose but your crystal balls." Chief Weston slapped the paper down. "What do you think of that?" I said, "He's just making noise. Telepathy has nothing in common with—" "I wish I could stop you from even thinking about telepathy." "If you could," I said calmly, "you'd have to be telepathic to determine when I had violated your dictum, and if you were telepathic, Chief, you'd have been on my side from the beginning." He merely glared at me. At this moment I should have been expecting the worst and prepared to meet it, but please remember that there's always that mental block against prying, especially when the United States mail is concerned. But now Edward Hazlitt Wood was about to show me how a real extrasensory sharpshooter clobbers his enemies. Weston's secretary entered carrying a package. I saw it, knew at once what it was, and groaned with despair. The only chance I saw of getting out of this was the forlorn hope that Weston would believe the package was a dig, probably mailed by the sniping columnist. It was cleverly contrived. The addressee's name had been blurred and half obliterated so that it couldn't have been quietly dropped on my desk, where I could have disposed of its damning contents quietly. It had, of course, come special delivery, urgent, immediate handling. If I were a believer in amulets, witches, and spells, I'd have been of the opinion that an aura of urgency had been created about the box. Chief Weston's secretary handed it to him with a mumbled suggestion that it seemed to be important, and perhaps it should be opened in hopes that the contents would convey information as to the identity of the owner. I said nothing. Inside the package was a fine crystal ball, a set of tarot cards, with a thick book of explanations, and a second deck of cards, the like of which most people have heard but few have actually seen. They were the square, circle, wiggly line cards used in parapsychic research. There was the damning evidence of a packing slip with my name clearly printed on it, and a rubber stamp notation that the merchandise order had been accompanied by a prepaid postal note. The timing was perfect. The problem of keeping that package on schedule all the way from its point of origin to its devastating delivery must have taxed Wood's faculties, but he'd done it. Chief Weston's collar rose visibly, and in a voice loud enough to be heard in Asbury Park, he yelled, "Schnell, did you buy this?" I was trapped. No matter what I said, it was calculated to get me into trouble. For in the petty cash box in the secretary's desk was a petty cash slip made out in the amount of $39.17 for a postal money order payable to the Aladdin Novelty Company of Bayonne, New Jersey. The signature was good enough for me to accept it myself. All along the line it had been nicely legal, or would have been if I had really signed that petty cash slip. If it came to an argument, I'd have to perform miracles to prove my innocence. "Schnell," said Weston in a cold, level voice, "you'll get me a lead on the Gordon Avenues murder by tomorrow night, or hand me your badge." I fumed in silence because there was nothing to say. "Get out!" As I closed the door behind me, I heard the crash of the crystal ball hitting the wall. Luckily, he hadn't hurled it at the glass panel in his office door. My own phone was ringing as I approached my desk. I picked it up wearily and said, "Very clever, Mr. Wood. Very damned clever." He said, "Your basic difficulty, Captain Schnell, is that you have sworn to uphold the law and are compelled to employ legal methods. You must always work within the framework of the law. You would not think of tampering with the United States mails, even to save yourself from an unjust charge. What if I make a single move outside of the law? You'll use it against me, won't you?" "I'm afraid that's the way it has to be. You play according to your rules, and I'll play according to mine." "Well now, Mr. Wood, in our philosophy there may be strength Remember upon the day that the forces of law and order must violate their own concepts in order to effect their own ends. On that day, law and order cease to be the goal of honest men. Spoken like an idealist. Hanging up a telephone is not polite. But in this case, hanging up did not snap the link of communication. An angry man is a poor fighter. I sat shuffling papers on my desk, half of my intellect raging helplessly. Finally, I forced myself to sit and read the papers on the desk, even though I knew every word on every one of them. One reported that Wood had been one of the less conspicuous partners in a very successful personnel placement agency. I could have added a penciled note that a telepath should make a very successful personnel manager. Another said that Florence Wood was employed as a safety deposit vault clerk in the Third National Bank. This didn't bother me. What the standard human gets out of staring at a solid phalanx of safety deposit boxes is a headache, not perceptive gained information. There was a medical report that Wood had undergone a mild coronary occlusion some months ago, which had hastened his retirement. I wondered whether his retirement had been hastened by a real coronary occlusion, or whether he'd used his extrasensory power to fake the symptoms and control the doctor's instruments. Among the papers was a complete dissertation on the stab wound in Gordon Andrews' chest. There was no trace of any foreign body. The wound did not go all the way through the chest cavity. It was not clean cut, as if made by a sharpened weapon, but more like the semi-rounded end of an umbrella or a blunt, heavy spike. In the opinion of the medical examiner, the wound had been made with a rapid thrust, but it looked as if there had been no withdrawal. An inspection of the wound for traces of excess water, icicles, or carbon dioxide, dry ice, had failed to disclose any plausible weapon or projectile that could have evaporated or sublimed out of existence. I longed to suggest that a test be made for air. If a kinematic can create pyrotic effects by agitation of the molecules in something to be ignited, a good kinematic could make Maxwell's demon go to work for him, like compressing a volume of air into a .38 slug and projecting it at revolver velocity. And in the end, I was not leafing the reports or reading them. I was really staring at the wall. Specifically, I was staring at the calendar without paying much attention to it. And as I came out of my reverie, I realized that I'd been absorbed in a little red smudge on one of the dates. Association is a funny process. The combination of calendar and red blob stared at hazily had finally brought my mind around to thinking of February the 14th, which honors a patron saint who has absolutely nothing to do with Jimmy Valentine, who was reputed to have been a very fast man with a combination of a safe, especially the type of safe that Gordon Andrews kept his money in, because he did not trust banks, which may have been a good idea considering that Florence Wood worked in a bank vault and her father. I jumped out of my office chair just as it tilted over backward. If I hadn't jumped, I'd have split my skull on the radiator under the window behind me. A heavy brass-edged ruler came up from the desk and swung in a whistling saber swipe at my face. I ducked in time to let the cut pass over my head. It clipped a few upstanding hairs. When it reached the end of its stroke, I wrested it out of Wood's control just to prove that an alert local force could exert more power than a distant kinematic force. Well, naturally, I could leverage, of course. Next came a metal-to-metal clicking sound. It was the police positive in the upper left-hand corner of my desk. I thought strongly. "Simon, you lift that gun and fire it at me through the desk drawer, and the angle and everything will be enough evidence to change Weston's opinion from angry rejection of all psionics to a cold calculated, vengeful agreement with everything I've suggested. The clicking stopped coming from the desk drawer and resumed in a smaller kind from the little desk lock in the tray drawer of the desk. These desk locks can be picked with a bent hairpin, but picking takes time. Everything takes time. At any rate, it did indeed take Edward Hazlitt Wood a finite time to juggle the little brass tumblers, turn the main cylinder, retract the sliding bolt, withdraw the desk tray to unlatch the side drawers, and pull open the upper left-hand drawer and extract my police positive from its holster with its mechanism entering the firing cycle, which itself takes time. By which time I'd evacuated my office and was starting across the outer office floor in the brisk, stiff-legged walk of a man in a hurry to go a long way fast. Wood was stalled, I thought. Make like a poltergeist, man, and convince everybody that you exist. The outer office was a bustle of the usual police activity. But Wood did not have the ability to invade another mind and take over. At least not one of the men in the office suddenly had a fit of homicidal mania, with Captain Schnell listed as the first victim, and so I made Weston's office and shoved my head in through the outer door and yelled, "Weston, Third National Bank, and make it fast!" I turned and headed outside as Weston started the usual top brass routine of wanting to know all of the infinitely variable reasons why he should leave his office at all, let alone right now. With no one to fire delaying questions at, and with a growing realization that he was not going to learn a thing by sitting there in fulmination, he followed. I paid no more attention to him once I knew he was on his way. I had my own hands full. Considering the general reliability of the average internal combustion engine in the face of neglect, abuse, and the natural ravages of weather, the automobile engine is a brute force mechanism completely unable to support a psychosis. I was, however, appalled to discover just how many little thumb valves, levers, wires, doodads, cams, gizmos, and cadoodles there are, each of which must be adjusted within ridiculously narrow limits before the so-called brute force mechanism will deign to turn a gear. But again, and luckily, making adjustments and maladjustments takes time. And by the logical rules of classical mechanics, the simple maladjusting turn of a screw valve takes no longer to return to adjustment, provided the restorer is as bright and quick as the wrecker. We worked our way through it like a pair of fencers or jiu-jitsu professionals going through the formal ritual of opening their engagement. He fastened the starting system, but I licked him cold on that one because the ignition key controls the starter relay switch, and I could handle both with one hand. He tried to block the starting relay, but the armature had started before he arrived with his kinematic barrier, and the solid mechano-electrical power carried the armature home. He made a futile attempt to flummox up the laws of Mr. Ohm, but he did not have the power to prevent amperes from flowing from the battery into the starting motor. By the time he thought of gumming up the Bendix, the gear had meshed against the flywheel and the engine was turning over. He tried to flood the engine, but I held the choke valve just as I wanted it. He fiddled with the breaker points, and I blocked that one until one of the cylinders fired. That kicked the whole engine into life and made the engine far too rapid to control, moving member by moving member. This caused his attention to turn to the needle valves, but as fast as he turned them out, I turned them back in again. He hit the choke again, and I parried his thrust. The engine kicked over, caught, spluttered, and backfired, and then went into an erratic running that smoothed out slightly as it warmed. I wasted no time. I kicked her into gear and took off in a jackrabbit start with my siren wailing. Exultantly, I thought, "Can you hit a moving target, man? Yes, you can stop an internal combustion engine turning at 3,000 revolutions per minute by yanking off the ignition system, but not when your opponent is doing everything in his power to prevent you. but not when both of you are traveling at 60 or more miles per hour, and you have a rougher driving course than he." My own siren was clearing my way, driving motorists to the shelter of the side streets and parking places, and causing my fellow policemen to take charge blocks ahead to clear the path for the vehicle that had the right to exceed the city speed limit. My worthy opponent drove at 60 miles per hour at his own risk, trying to race me to the Third National Bank. Wood's extrasensory driving was no better than mine. The traffic pattern was clear to both of us. But who should know better than a policeman what the average motorist will do in the face of an emergency? He took the time now and then to hurl something at me, but this was not very effective. If you think not, figure how many things you can see and use as weapons while driving at 60. And two, he was also fighting the unfavorable end of a missile problem called terminal control, which simply states that any guided missile approaching its target is subject to greater and greater interference by the enemy as it gets closer. Wood's near misses I ignored with a disdain calculated to make him furious, and his near hits I blocked with an ease that proved my ability to outguess and outmaneuver him. I chuckled to myself, for Edward Hazlitt Wood had been played off balance. He'd committed the hysterical mistake of fighting me on my ground instead of his. He had thrust and I'd parried and advanced, forcing him to thrust again before he could recover. He'd been fighting in the very odd position of conducting a vigorous offense while backstepping in inexorable retreat. He should have run and run until he was clear enough to prepare a single telling blow. And so ultimately I came to the front of the Third National Bank in a screeching halt. I stepped under a falling cornice, neatly avoided a revolving door that tried to slice me, and sidestepped the bronze bust of Salmon P. Chase that toppled from its niche of honor above the door. I evaded the erratic rolling of a pencil, and I trod with unerring step on a circular patch of invisible stuff that was as slippery as the proverbial frictionless lubricant. The slick flowed forward and down over the stairs as I hurried below. I held myself erect above it by sheer willpower. As I strode toward the safety deposit vault, I thought exultantly, "You're outpointed, Simon." Florence Wood looked up from her little desk and cried, "Why, Captain Schnell, how nice to see you." "Hello," I said with a smile. "I hope you won't mind my company for a while." "I'm not likely to go for a stroll in—" "Captain Schnell, don't!" 7½ tons of finely wrought and polished tool steel alloy swung on delicately balanced hinges, coming to rest with a metal-to-metal sound of machined surfaces sliding into a perfect fit with its precision-matched receptacle. Its piston fit made a pressure on our eardrums. Then the automatic switches took over, and motors whirled in solid, muffled harmony as the massive bars slid out of their nests into the polished slots. The ponderous operation that sealed the two of us off from the outside world behind a barrier of drill-proof and burglar-proof and blast-proof solidity concluded not with the mechanical fanfare it deserved, but with a gentle little click that was as final as the word of God. "Do that!" gasped Florence Wood, weakly finishing her admonition. She stared at me. The knowledge that this bank vault door was equipped with a time lock that would not permit it to be opened except in the interval between 9:15 and 9:30 in the morning of any working weekday ceased to be more information and became vitally important to Florence Wood. So did the secondary knowledge that the bank vault was also contrived in available volume to limit the breathable air. There was not enough to support the average human adult overnight until opening time tomorrow morning. Now there were two of them entombed in it, and she was one of them. "We'll die!" she screamed. "Trust me, Florence, She looked dubious. She was not at all willing to regard anyone as competent who was so foolish as to lock himself into a bank vault, and her with him. Florence was still struggling through her sea of mixed thoughts when the telephone rang. It was Chief Weston, and he bellowed almost loud enough to hear through the yards of concrete and steel that separated us. "Schnell, what in the bloody hell have you done?" "I've shut the vault," I said. "You'll die." "I doubt it." "How do you propose to get out?" he demanded with heavy sarcasm. "Just ask Edward Hazlitt Wood, the Psi-man in our midst." "Schnell, if you get out of there alive, I'm going to ask for your If I get out of here alive, you'll need every faculty I have to keep our Psi-man jugged for good." "You and your extrasensory!" "Chief, get it through your thick skull that I am so convinced I'm right that I'm betting my life on it." "And can you tell me why he's going to give himself away to rescue you?" "Because I have his daughter right here beside me." "Schnell!" "Stop yakking, Chief. Call me when Wood arrives. I have an emotional problem on my hands down here." "How do you know Wood's coming?" "He's been following my every move by telepathy," I said, "and he's been trying to block me all the way. Ha! He knows all right." Then I hung up to stop a lot of senseless gab. I turned to Florence, who was just beginning to understand what I had said and what it meant to both her and her father. She stood there with shocked eyes regarding me, and with one hand pressed back against her teeth, she said, "I don't believe it," in a barely audible voice. "I'm sorry. It's true," I told her. "It can't be true." "That's what you'd like to believe," I said softly, "but the fact remains that your father is a killer." "I'd rather die." "Florence, the choice between death and dishonor is not yours to make. Whether you live or die is up to your father, who was guilty of placing you in this awkward position by turning his talents to evil." She stared at me. "But how could you—" There was no other way but to bait this trap emotionally. "So cold and cruel." I nodded. "So are the pioneers who saved one last bullet for their wives." How could I tell this hurt girl that I had looked time and again into the minds of killers and found them far worse than the deeds they committed? When the official record states that upon such and such a date, so-and-so was punished for his crime, how is he punished for the harm he did to those who placed their trust in him? I hate them because they force me to reveal them for what they are, making me an agent of their betrayal. The phone rang again. "Yeah, Chief." "Schnell, Wood's just arrived. What shall I tell him?" "Don't bother. He knows it all." "Schnell, granting that you are right, why should he show his hand when he knows, or could easily find out, that the time lock-setting mechanism is on your side of that vault door?" "Sure it is," I replied, "but it's covered by a sheet of 5-ply safety glass." "Use your revolver." "Chief, reprimand me for a violation of regulations if you must, but let me point out that only an idiot would wear a gun when he's pitting himself against a Psi-man." "Got everything figured out, haven't you, Schnell?" "Chief," I said, "this affair started in a sealed room, and now it's going to end in one." I yanked on the telephone and pulled it out of its connection block, snapping that link of communication. Then, to satisfy Edward Hazlitt Wood, I hurled the instrument as hard as I could against the safety glass. The telephone bounced as if I had thrown it against 6 solid feet of battleship plate armor. I thought. "Psi-man, you are trapped," he thought. I've killed before, Schnell. Why shouldn't I profess helplessness and innocence and accuse you and the whole police department of the stupid and wanton death of my beloved daughter? Because you've erred, Psyman. Ah, now I have proof. You're a Psyman too. Who, me? I thought, without a visible change in my expression for Florence Wood to see. You're the one who erred. You neglected the rules. Not so stupid, Wood. The law is really very sensible. It's strong, Wood, and it fosters the strength that comes of following it. So you see, Simon Wood, by never making any overt use of my talent, by never admitting that I know more than any clever man can see and deduce from what he knows, it has now become quite obvious to Chief Weston that if any such shenanigans as extrasensory manipulation of this bank vault door take place, you're the only one suspected of parapsychic power. And then the time lock setting dials clicked around, their tiny nose muted by the glass door. They came around until they pointed to the present time. Then came the louder manipulation of outside dial lock, the heavy click of massive tumblers, and then the solid turning sound of wheel and mighty lever. The vault door swung open. Outside, a pale and speechless man faced me, looking at his daughter. Weston was shaking his head, but the confusion was clearing. Weston was a good man, quite willing to operate without a full explanation, so long as there was a reasonable probability that some reasonable explanation would come later. The president and 4 vice presidents of the bank stared at their vault door in dismay, wondering how anyone could from now on rely on any protection, if the best of the vault maker's art could be opened with such ease. And Florence, she started forward with a glad cry, but stopped in mid-stride as she realized the full truth in those fractions of a second. She became the full mature adult who had been hurt, and who knew that hurt and pain are not the end. She stopped a full yard from him and whispered, "Daddy, you did it." He looked at her out of frantic eyes. I didn't. Chief Weston took a pair of handcuffs from one of the uniformed cops and held them up in front of Edward Hazlitt Wood's eyes. "Come quietly, Wood, or must I weld them on you?" Stunned, knowing that any move he made I would block, the murderer turned to go. I was going to have quite an interesting intellectual problem to solve. I was going to have to testify that I was clever enough to trap an extrasensory criminal without displaying my own extrasensory talent. It wasn't just a matter of putting a possible ending to my official usefulness to the forces of law and order if the facts became known. One word of suspicion against Captain Howard Schnell, and some clever defense attorney would raise a wholly reasonable doubt as to which Psyman opened that vault door. And being sworn to uphold the law and enforce the law within the framework of the law itself, I'd have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. But according to the same sensible law, not unless I was specifically asked. And to answer Edward Hazlitt Wood's question, the perfect answer to the perfect crime committed by the perfect criminal is a perfect retribution. Please join me next week for more fantastic adventure on astounding stories of space and time. Until then, watch the skies.